Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss the culture and art of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Lawrence Gianangeli. Andiamo avanti. Hello, my Renaissance people, and welcome back to the Italian Renaissance podcast. Today I have something special in store for you, as we're going to experiment with a new perspective on presenting this very complicated historical moment. We're going to look at three artists, one architect, one sculptor, and one painter, in order to really conceptualize what the early Renaissance looks like in terms of a somewhat uniform and harmonized aesthetic concept. That does not mean that these works look the same, but rather that we've arrived at a point where the conventions will be more or less solidified and changed into a clear Renaissance style from their medieval precedents. In addition to that, as one looks to podcast about the history of these artists and their patrons, making decisions about who and what to discuss actually becomes very difficult. So, this is my way of offering some attention to a group of very remarkable artists. I also want to look at the styles these artists are deploying, but I'm stressing that each of the works we will look at is by a different patron, and each has a very different function. So we're going to talk about Michelozzo in his Medici Palace for Cosimo de Medici, which is in Florence. We're going to talk about Jacopo della Quercia, his funerary monument to Ilaria del Cerreto, which is in Lucca, and lastly, Domenico Veneziano's St. Lucy altarpiece, which was probably done for the Uzzano family in Florence. It's a palace, a tomb, and a painting, so andiamo avanti. So let's briefly dive into the life of Michelozzo. His name is Michelozzo di Bartolomeo, and he was a key figure of the early Renaissance whose work truly shaped the architecture of Florence. He was born in 1396, and Michelozzo started his career as a sculptor, and he trained under the famous Lorenzo Ghiberti. But it was in architecture where he really made his mark. He worked closely with big names like Donatello, like Brunelleschi. For example, he worked on Donatello on that fabulous pulpit at Santo Stefano in Prato, where the Holy Girdle is displayed from. Like Donatello, Michelozzo also became a favorite of Cosimo de Medici, that is, Cosimo the Elder, not Duke Cosimo of the 16th century. Let's never get them confused. So Michelozzo's style was about balance, combining the classical influences of ancient Rome with the clean, elegant lines of the new Renaissance aesthetic. And that's what I want us to stay with, this idea of an established, developed aesthetic. He also worked on religious buildings, so like the Basilica of San Marco in Florence. He left behind a legacy that influenced countless architects who came after him. One of Michelozzo's most famous creations is the Palazzo Medici Riccardi, our object of interest today. This is a stunning example of a Renaissance palace design that still stands in Florence today. Michelozzo might not be the most famous name from the Renaissance, but his contributions were vital in shaping the architecture of the era, especially in palace architecture, which would be the example for major Renaissance patrons in Florence, such as the Strozzi family and the Rucellai in their palaces. So when you walk around Florence and you recognize the architectural motifs that make up these monumental Renaissance palaces throughout the city, keep in mind this starts with Michelozzo. The Palazzo Medici was commissioned by Cosimo after his return from exile in Venice. So, upon his reconsolidation of power and the decline of his very fierce rivals, the Albizzi family. Construction began in 1446. So, Cosimo needed a palace that could simultaneously display his power and confine his public image to that of a citizen of Republican Florence, even though he was pulling the strings behind the curtain. That means that architecture itself, through Michelozzo, becomes a mode of propaganda, especially in the form of a family palace that serves as a semi-public space as well, right, on the business front of things. Be aware, the palace that you see today when you go to Florence, it's only partially the original because it was expanded in the 17th century by the Riccardi family and is now known as the Palazzo Medici Riccardi. We are only talking about the original design by Michelozzo today. Part of the palace that's on the corner of the street is the original when you go to it. And it was lived in by Cosimo de Medici, by his son Piero de' Medici, and ultimately by Lorenzo the Magnificent. So most of what we see is original on the outside to Michelozzo's design, with the exception of some additions by Michelangelo at the request of Pope Leo X, that is Giovanni de' Medici, the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. So the pedimented windows, when you look at this palace, on the ground floor, pediments added to the windows were part of Michelangelo's partial redesign under Pope Leo X. We are talking about a square plan built around a central courtyard, very much in the schematic style of ancient Roman houses, known through the writings of the ancient architect Vitruvius. In that very courtyard is actually where one would have found Donatello's David, and on the second floor, in the private chapel, Benozzo Gozzoli's Procession of the Magi, my personal favorite frescoes of the Renaissance. Those are discussed in previous episodes. So there's a sense of reserved sumptuousness that we get from the balance between high level of craft and art and the actual external facade of the building. So when you look at it, first impression that you get is it has a fortress-like quality. It imposes stability, impenetrability, while being often open to business through these massive portoni, big, big doors. So, yes, it looks like you cannot enter. Then you have these large gateways to get in, and above the ground floor is what you have is called the piano nobile. That is a term still used in Italian today to refer to the second level of a building, and that is because that is where the nobility actually lived. The noble floor, right above the ground floor, because the ground floor was reserved for businesses, what have you. Think back to our discussions on the Venetian Renaissance palaces, where you had the ground floor for merchant goods that would come in through the canals. The same premise.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Renaissance people, if you are enjoying the Italian Renaissance podcast, I have good news. We're now active on Patreon. You can show your love for the show by becoming a patron and get access to additional resources, information, and artworks. Better yet, those who join the Renaissance Master or Renaissance Patron tier will get access to at least one additional podcast episode each month. My goal is to ensure that the main podcast remains a free, accessible source for everyone. Become a patron today through the link in the show notes to support the continued production of new episodes and help build and maintain this community. The Italian Renaissance shop is now also active on Etsy, linked in the show notes. Sport our logo or choose from a growing selection of Italian art-inspired designs. Discounts are offered to select Patreon tiers as well. Your support has my immortal gratitude. Now, enjoy the show.
So from the exterior, the ground floor has heavy rustication, right? They're rusticated stones. The stones look rough cut. They look fortified. They look ancient. So the stones actually smooth as you go up each level. So the lower level is the most rough looking, and they gradually become smooth on each level. It makes it look lighter towards the top. So remember, now that we're in the 1440s, artists are looking much closer. Ancient Roman ruins. The rustication is a direct reference to the Forum of Emperor Augustus in Rome, which in Michelozzo's time was supposedly thought to be the palace of Julius Caesar, the founder of Florence. So immediately a very rough unrefined look can simultaneously relate Cosimo de Medici to Julius Caesar, especially to the educated elite who would get those references, and it allows Cosimo to appear as if he is not asserting himself above other Florentine citizens because of the reduction in grandeur. Crazy, right? Yeah, and this rustication evokes antiquity itself just by looking old, offering the legibility of a timelessness to Medici power. Useful rhetoric for a family returned from political exile. And the cherry on top of Michelozzo's design, quite literally, is the cornice attached to the roof. That is the sculpted overhang on the roof that goes out over the space of the building. The cornice parallels a bench that runs along the perimeter of the ground floor below. We can imagine citizens sitting on the palace bench, people there for business, waiting to have an audience with the Medici Bank, trusted cohort, protected from the rain from the cornice above. There's this sense of public space, the exterior of the palace and the internal courtyard. Renaissance people, follow me here. Although the cornice does indeed appear in many ways throughout ancient Roman architecture, it seems highly likely that Michelozzo and Cosimo have devised a palace in Florence that directly relates to the Colosseum in Rome. Gigantic cornice, likewise replicating form. Thus, the understanding of the Colosseum as a public building built for the people of Rome as a tribute to them solidifies the public nature of the Medici Bank as a place of money loaning, of interaction between the Medici family, and the ways in which they continued to finance the city of Florence in both civil terms and in the beautification of the city through their patronage. So you can see this Colosseum-like appearance in the original building outfitted with the windows that are Roman arches on all three levels, topped with this massive cornice. It's like a squared Colosseum, except it also housed the private living quarters of the Medici family. Its position is politically important too because it's placed diagonal to the newly designed San Lorenzo by Brunelleschi, which now holds most of the Medici tombs among artworks created through Medici patronage. So this links, diagonal link links, this diagonal links the Medici to San Lorenzo, in which, of course, Lorenzo the Magnificent, his uncle Lorenzo, they are all named after this saint. San Lorenzo is one of the patron saints of the Medici family, and they are building their palace right within the confines of San Lorenzo's basilica. So Michelozzo, then, his palace for Cosimo de' Medici is this standard, newly developed concept of antiquity as symbolic for a contemporary moment. But if we step back a couple decades, if we turn the page from Michelozzo and we look at our second artist in question today, let's take a quick look at Jacopo della Quercia, one of the great sculptors of the early Italian Renaissance. He was born around 1374. He's a little older than Michelozzo, and he was born in Siena. So he's not a Florentine. Woot woot. Okay, we don't always have to talk about Florentines here. Jacopo was known for his powerful, expressive sculptures that actually had quite a grand influence on later artists, which include Michelangelo, of course. So one of the most famous works is the Fonte Gaia in Siena's Piazza del Campo, not our subject today. It's a stunning public fountain that showcased his skill in carving dynamic, lifelike figures, including the female nude, remarkably. And he also worked on the intricate reliefs for the Porto of San Petronio in Bologna. If you've been to Bologna, it is the church with the incomplete facade and beautiful pink and white marble. Those figures are carved by Jacopo della Quercia and are quite strange, actually. He was also a competitor in the 1401 contest for the Florence Baptistry doors. Remember that famous contest that Lorenzo Ghiberti won, much to Brunelleschi's dissatisfaction. Jacopo's style was bold, dramatic, blended some early medieval traditions, really solidified the emerging Renaissance ideals, and his work helped standardize the sculptural tendency to reference antiquity. Let's get into that. We should always be cautious when something is called a first, unless it is certain. We can say with confidence that Donatello's Bronze David is the first lifelike bronze nude since antiquity, but Donatello is often also credited as the first sculptor to revive the antique puto, right? Those dancing little cherubs. So that is not so. Actually, among the earliest use of putti, if not the artist who first revived their use for funerary sculpture, was Jacopo della Quercia in his funerary monument for Ilaria del Careto inside the Cathedral of San Martino in Lucca. This is the work we're talking about, the funerary monument to Ilaria del Careto. So who was she? Well, Ilaria was a noblewoman who married the Lord of Lucca, Paolo Guinigi, in 1403. His palace is a museum today if you go to Lucca. She unfortunately died in childbirth 2 years later in 1405, which means her sarcophagus is dated to around 1406. Immediately, stylistically, it is actually taking after some contemporary French sculpture, the mode of this sort of laid down body on top of the sarcophagus, and Ilaria is dressed in the fashion of the Burgundy courts, and the dog at her feet references French funerary sculpture, the dog being a sign of both her status and a symbol of her own assumed fidelity towards her husband, Lord Guinigi, and yet under her head we see the imprese, that is the coat of arms of both the Guinigi and Ilaria's own house, the Careto house. We have to understand that the patron of this work is Paolo Guinigi, Lord of Lucca, not Ilaria, and not the Careto family. And so he is playing politics here by honoring the family in which he united with through his marriage, but also the secondary power that his heir enjoys as Ilaria's son, which, by the way, is not the child who she died giving birth to. It was a daughter, and therefore, in Renaissance terms, she was only good for being married off to another family. That was the unfortunate reality. And the dog, let's look back at this dog, this symbol of fidelity, this symbol of the good wife, right? Haha. He makes us look at her and this delicate expression on her face, her nobility in death that then falls behind her head to those heraldic devices. So the dog sort of looks up to her and it leads us to her. She is honored, yes, but like most upper class Renaissance women, he is a tool for the continuation of the male line, the bearer of male heirs, and a vessel to unify families and build powerful alliances. This is the unfortunate truth. Still, it is not pure objectification, as if we can imagine the period mindset saw her role as essential and honorable and thus immortalized this idea in pristine marble. What I mean to say is the misogynistic patriarchal scheme of the Renaissance did indeed honor the role of women, and we see that in this sarcophagus. But that honor doesn't filter through our modern lens to actually be anything good. Okay? But in the time, someone like Lord Guinigi might see this as a means to honor. So to come full circle to what our original conversation was, the sides of her tomb are decorated with the marks of antiquity, dancing putti, holding up garlands, which are directly taken from antique sculpture. That is, little fat winged babies modeled directly from ancient Roman sarcophagi in the year now 1406, years before Donatello would do the same. Hypernaturalism in depicting Ilaria at rest, along with the ways in which Jacopo has brought back antique sculptural motifs, has now become a standard for Quattrocento sculptural practices in Italy, and it starts here. Not wholly, this isn't like the first reference to antiquity, but it is the first monumental revival of Putti, the Putti garland motif. So now following on from Michelozzo and Jacopo della Quercia, architecture and sculpture, let's turn to another key figure of the early Renaissance, the painter Domenico Veneziano. He was born around 1410, so now we're shifting in time again, right? We started in the 1440s, we've jumped back into the early 1400s. We're now born in 1410, and what we're going to look at is from the 1440s. He was born probably in Venice, since his name is Veneziano, Venetian, right? Domenico the Venetian. He certainly shows his Northern Italian style in his painting. He was only 51 years old when he died in 1461. So, a short career in terms of, well, an average career in terms of Renaissance artists. Domenico made a name for himself with his revolutionary use of color and light. His first recorded presence is actually in Perugia, and he also spent some time in Rome and ultimately in Florence, where we're going to look at a painting he did. That is the standout work, the St. Lucy altarpiece, the Santa Lucia altarpiece, if you will, where he captured the subtlety of natural light in a way that was indeed ahead of his time. While he worked mostly in Florence, his probable Venetian roots influenced his vibrant color palette, blending beautifully with the emerging techniques of the Florentine school. He worked alongside other great artists like Piero della Francesca, shaping the future of Renaissance painting with his innovative approach to light, perspective, and harmonious composition, predominantly on the tails of earlier painters like Masaccio. The St. Lucy altarpiece was painted by Domenico Veneziano around 1445 to 1447, right around the time of the Medici Palace. It was made for the high altar of Santa Lucia de' Magnoli in Florence, which was under the patronage of the Uzzano family, a pro-Medician group who helped restore Cosimo to Florence. It depicts the Madonna and Child enthroned, surrounded by saints, including Saint Lucy, Saint John the Baptist, and Saint Francis. The painting is celebrated for its luminous use of color, soft, natural light, which gives the figures a serene and almost ethereal quality. So Domenico's mastery of perspective, his innovation use of light, it creates a sense of depth and harmony, making the piece a key milestone in the transition towards more realistic, human-centered art during the Renaissance. I want to stress that this painting in the 1440s holds the sense of a Renaissance modernity. What is modern? What is a modern looking work in the Renaissance? This. That is, that the people in the period, it was a wholly modern work, completely removed in all sense from the Gothic precedent or even the emerging Renaissance style that blended with the Gothic. This is the next step away. It is square shaped, first of all. No more arched, gilded Gothic frames with pinnacles set into these pointed arches, gilded in gold. Indeed, the arches here are entirely painted on in a magnificent green and pink, which recalls the marble facades and churches of Florence. Look at this painting, where the perspective is perfect, the floor inlaid with precise marble patterns that creates recession and depth. This is one of the earliest sacra conversazioni, that painting type shows the Madonna enthroned among saints, but one where the scale and naturalism are harmonized in the new Renaissance modern mode. Yet, the altarpiece is not entirely Florentine in style, with this harsh outline and heavily filled in contours that was typical for Florentine art. They're gone. Delicate brushworks, blending of colors, a wider range and scale and variation of shadow. Indeed, Giorgio Vasari, that famous author of the Lives of the Artists, when he wrote about Domenico Veneziano, he mistakenly called this work an oil painting. It is not, right? The predella, which is the narrative, runs below a painting on an altarpiece, smaller paintings, which I will not go over in complete detail. But what I do want to point out is that one of the paintings, the panel paintings in the predella, shows a nude depiction of Saint John the Baptist in the wilderness. who stands almost like a classical Greek nude, much like the earlier paintings by Masaccio. So, very interesting here. Brief aside for my own pleasure. Over 100 years later, Caravaggio would also do a series of highly eroticized images of St. John in the wilderness, which were likely modeled on his own romantic interest, his pupil, Cecco del Caravaggio. I like to think this precedent in the St. Lucy altarpiece, the use of classical revival and St. John's complete anatomy, is an interesting lens here through to look ahead to what Caravaggio's eventually going to do. But in any case, when you look at the St. Lucy altarpiece, think about the ways that Domenico Veneziano departs from artists like Gentile da Fabriano, Lorenzo Monaco, and Masaccio. Indeed, we are now in the age of Fra Angelico and Filippo Lippi, who we will eventually talk about, those great painters that paved the way for the High Renaissance, whose pictorial mode, especially Filippo Lippi's, is directly coherent with that of Domenico Veneziano. 3 artists, 3 patrons, 3 mediums: architecture, sculpture, and painting. Can we look at the transition in artistic style along the lines of a uniform aesthetic? I think so, as we have here, but we do it with some caution. Nothing, and I mean nothing, is ever really standardized, especially with the minds and personalities of the artist and the patron relationship. Still, there is a way in which we can look to unify the stylistic movement that is the Renaissance, particularly in the early to mid Quattrocento. Michelozzo, with his classicizing architecture that spoke to Cosimo's sense of power and civic virtue, with Jacopo della Quercia's tomb for Ilaria that reinforced a hierarchy of gender and power, but immortalized a heightened essence of a person through looking back to ancient Rome, which was enough to convince the immortality of such artwork, given that they were looking at works that were 12 to 1400 years old. And finally, to Domenico Veneziano, who is particularly important for the new look of the altarpiece, now far removed from the Gothic precedent, and a display of technical mastery of light, of space, and, in this case, devotional significance. I do hope you found this conversation interesting, and it was a particular joy for me to be able to bring multiple artists and multiple mediums from around the same period into the fold and to expand upon our working knowledge of the early Renaissance in a more abstract sense, doing some mental gymnastics to jump through some hoops, especially since sculpture is developing a little earlier, and architecture, painting, they don't all align necessarily, but when you look at them in this way, you can see how across 30 to 40 years, the way antique revival became a central mode of Renaissance modernity. That is my point. This departure from this old style and the development of a new one, right? Almost in the same way that Jackson Pollock came around and started splattering paint, or that Pablo Picasso started to do abstraction, cubism, these sorts of things. The way we read them, or the way people read them in the 20th century, was this sort of like, oh, what's this? Okay, that's modernity for the 20th century. This is modernity for the 15th century. Does that make sense to you all? I do hope you will all continue to engage with this project, especially on Instagram, where I do most of the post and extra information, and on all of our other social media platforms. This project is growing more and more, so please show you're part of the community by subscribing wherever you can, leaving reviews of the shows, liking, commenting, and engaging the material so we continue to grow. My dear Renaissance people, until next time, arrivederci.